Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the third session of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and thinkers in multiple fields, hosted by the Center to continue important conversations that we have around religion, American culture, and the broader issues facing our world. The first two episodes were a dynamic and thought-provoking discussions on race and gender in the political landscape and the 2020 election. And I want to thank those scholars that took time out of their schedules to provide a remarkable and important contributions to our field and to the people that were able to join us. I want to thank you for last month. I want to thank Andrew Whitehead, Amanda Friesen, and Jamel Drake, and Janelle Wong for our November election episodes. The responses to these episodes have been remarkable, with scholars engaging one another on the topics of the day, with teachers using them as modules in their classroom, and our surveys telling us that they have been impactful in ways that were really unexpected and unimagined as we were designing this series. In all, the Religion and series continues the work that the Center has been doing for the last 32 years through our biannual conferences, our Young Scholars Program, and the public engagement and teaching that we do throughout this country. So thank you again for joining us today. And we hope that you will join us every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time as we discuss topics that look at the relationship between religion, the pressing issues of our day, and their impacts on the fields we study. Today, our third session, and I'm so excited that you all are here, examined religion and pandemics, vaccines, and public policy. As you all know, 2020 has been dominated by a variety of responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, from outright fear to blatant disregard to interventions sanctioned by local governments and organizations. And now, with a vaccine on the horizon, scholars, public health officials, and the greater public are asking, how do we approach and communicate a thoughtful and ethical model for the distribution and safe implementation of a vaccine protocol? And in today's panel, we will look at not only the contemporary issues that face these public policy and public sector questions, but we will look at the history of pandemics and vaccine protocols, how religion and American communities have shaped these responses, and what tools our fields offer to deal with the thorny ethical issues that emerge in the midst of surviving and responding during a global health crisis like this. So I know we are going to have a fantastic conversation, and we have gathered together a group of folks that are going to help walk us through this discussion. Please remember that throughout today's session, we are asking folks to submit questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. This will enable our hosts and panelists to engage these questions as they facilitate this important conversation. So if you are going to use the chat room, which we're fine with you using, please do that, but don't use that to post questions for our panelists. That can just be conversation that folks are having throughout today's discussion. But without any further ado, I would like to introduce our host for today, and then they will introduce our other panelists. Our first host is Dr. Richard Gunderman, who is the Chancellor's Professor of Radiology, Pediatrics, Medical Education, Philosophy, Liberal Arts, Philanthropy, and Medical Humanities and Health Studies. That's a long title at Indiana University. He is the author. His resume is so long that I couldn't even begin to try to cut it short, but he is the author of over 470 articles. That is not a typo or misspoken, and has published 8 books, with the one that is the most kind of connected to today's conversation. His latest book is entitled Contagion, the amazing story of history's deadliest diseases. And so we are so excited to have Dr. Richard Gunderman with us this afternoon. And our other host, who is equally as accomplished, and I'm excited to have her here, is Dr. Krista Hoffmann-Longtin, who is an assistant professor of communication studies and an assistant dean in the IU School of Medicine, Office of Faculty Affairs and Professional Development. Her work focuses on faculty development, organizational and professional identity, and strategic communication in academic health settings. And we are so excited to have her not only as a member of the School of Liberal Arts doing work on community engage and public engagement through the School of Liberal Arts, but also working with Dr. Gunderman in the School of Medicine. So I would like to hand it over to Krista and Richard, who will now get us started in this very important conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tucker Edmonds. I'm so excited to be here today. I really appreciate the invitation. And Dr. Gunderman, so great to be on this panel with you. And I'm so excited to get to know and chat with our esteemed guests and panelists today. So I'll do a quick introduction of Dr. Cobb and Dr. Koch before we get started in our conversation. And as Dr. Tucker Edmonds mentioned, if it ends in a question mark, please put it in the Q&A for us. I'll be monitoring that throughout our time today, and we would love to have your engagement and your participation in what I think will be a really lively conversation. So with that, let me start by introducing our first panelist, Dr. Ryan Cobb. May I call you Ryan? Is that okay? Ryan is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Georgia. As a scholar of racial stratification in the United States, one line of his research program operationalizes the idea that racial identification is a multidimensional social construct and assesses how self and observer assessed dimensions of this construct relate to biological and mortality risks. And we're really excited to hear about how your recent work, Ryan, I think fits really well with our topic today that is focused on this pandemic, thinking about the vaccine and thinking about how we engage communities in conversation of these topics. So thank you so much for being here. And Pippa Cook, Dr. Pippa Cook is an assistant professor of religious studies at Missouri State University. Her main research interest is in the history of religion in America with a focus on colonial America and the Atlantic world. In Dr. Cook's book project, The Course of God's Providence, Religion, Health, and the Body in Early America, she examines how Christian communities responded to sickness and epidemics in a context of ever new medical and scientific developments. And again, I just am so excited about the nexus of this work because I think that it really does draw on some of the really important and as Joseph said, kind of ethical and thorny topics that we're dealing with, particularly with the rollout of the vaccine and how this pandemic has disproportionately affected particularly communities of color and other marginalized communities. So thank you both for being here. So happy to have you here today. I thought that we kind of might start with a broad question, and then Dr. Gunderman, if you want to jump in, I think that would be great. But maybe Ryan, if you could respond to this first question, which is sort of, given the work that you've done lately and you're reading and listening and working with communities, in your experience, what role have religious communities and religious leaders played in responding to the current pandemic?
So it's a great question. It's great to be here. So the first one is obviously why when we discuss about the role of religion in shaping beliefs and responses to the outbreak. Our focus is on white evangelical congregations, and so we hear these stories of pastors who are unwilling to either pastors in some of their congregants are unwilling to believe that COVID-19 is a major threat to their health, as well as those who believe that it's a plot by the Democratic Party to overtake the world, and how their congregations respond to it, largely by not taking up certain safety precautions, not wearing masks, still going in open spaces without protection, and also infecting their congregations, getting infected. I have a friend that pastor was laying hands on people during the revival, and he, unbeknownst to him, he had COVID-19 and transmitted it to many of the people he's praying for. And so then how that shaped the congregational life. The one part my colleagues and I were looking at is how specifically this shapes how the COVID-19 outbreak shaped religious life among Black Americans. And so, and we can talk about this throughout today's conversation. One is the demographic shifts. And so we know that Blacks in the United States are increasingly leaving Black congregations to attend or affiliate with either religious traditions that are not historically Black or congregations that are not overwhelmingly Black. And specifically what we're finding is that in terms of those who attend evangelical congregations, that their views of the COVID-19 outbreak is no different than their white counterparts, in that you see more that there's less of a concern of the COVID-19 outbreak being a threat to their lives or a threat to their health than Blacks who attend religious services and other traditions. And so the role that they have is really complex, but it's really, I don't think it's on the side of the congregants who are specifically Black congregants, who are more likely to be infected with the COVID-19 virus than what we would expect.
And I think that that clarification and that nuance there is important, right? Because I think that that's one of the things that's so challenging about this pandemic is that we tend to have these broad stroke conversations rather than really digging into, as you said, some of the demographic factors that might ultimately be shaping folks' perceptions of who is ill and where folks are interacting around this issue. So I appreciate that. Pippa, do you want to jump in there with a response to that question before we move over to Richard's question?
Oh, sure. I mean, I would just add to that I live in Southwest Missouri where there are a lot of mega churches. And so this has been sort of in the news lately here. And we see churches, it's a very careful dance between churches and public authorities because the churches have a lot of goodwill from the community. And so if they're willing to sort of work together, you can see a lot of good coming from that. And I think a lot of churches have transitioned in some pretty interesting ways online and have done a lot of work to sort of make community accessible virtually. But what we hear about in the news is these sort of, cringeworthy events, right? And a local church here was in the news lately having a huge Christmas pageant with thousands of unmasked worshipers, which is, a key example of that. But I would say that there are communities, and I had students write papers on doing virtual visits to religious communities this semester, and the vast majority of the students went to virtual services and found a really robust community there. So I think that, it is important to keep in mind that some places are working with public health authorities in responsible ways that I think will play out in some pretty interesting ways for scholarship to study long term.
I share your sense that some of the popular news media coverage of religion and faith communities during the pandemic has been, let's say, lamentable. Could you help us think imaginatively, what would an admirable response of religion or faith communities to the pandemic we've been suffering this year look like?
Do you want to go first, Ryan, or?
Go ahead.
Well, I was reading an article in the Washington Post earlier this week about a community in Houston, I think it was, where the article was focused on a Black congregation where the pastor was inviting a medical a healthcare worker, I can't remember if it was a physician or someone else, to give the congregation, inviting them to speak to the congregation too. So they weren't just hearing from the pastor, but there was this sort of local person who was in conversation with the community who, knows what the concerns are in a very local way, who had the ear of the community to talk about health issues in a responsible way. And I think it was funny because I was just rereading a chapter about the yellow fever epidemic in the 18th century, where you see, pastors inviting medical authorities to come in and use church. If you are going to hold church, use church as an opportunity to give good information. Of course, that you can't control that and you can't police that. And sometimes the medical information will be irresponsible, but you do see examples where this is a great chance to reach people, particularly people who are vaccine hesitant or, worried about masking or something like that.
All right, so to just follow up, I think Francis Collins the Washington Post interviewed Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, until past week. And so just having more of a dialogue and encouraging congregations, number one, to still remain closed, especially during the winter. And number two, having conversations with public health officials and informing congregants about the COVID-19 outbreak, and especially even for those who have had it and it's cleared their body, what the longstanding effects of COVID-19 may also be. And that's part of the public discussion I think is left out, is that many people think, including members of my family, that if you have it, it gets out of your body, you're fine. And what we're finding is that that's not the case, especially with, as it relates to kidney function and the relates to cognitive decline. That COVID-19, that having the virus leaves an imprint one's systems.
So both of you gave, I think, some really good examples there, historical examples and also current examples of places where we see the sort of nexus or Venn diagram, if you will, of religious communities kind of playing a role in sharing scientific information or sharing accurate information with the public at large. Why is it so important to engage religious communities in that conversation? Why not just keep those two sort of ideas separate? And maybe Pippa, if you can respond to start, and then Ryan, maybe follow up.
Sure. They both, historically speaking, these are both communities that have an not outsized authority, but have significant authority in a community, right? And so when they are at odds with each other, it can really create, you know, a sort of a sense of a lack of trust in one or the other. And that is incredibly problematic for people who already feel a real sense of anxiety about the world around them, a loss of control. I think we all can kind of commiserate with that loss of control, some of us much more than others, but we don't have that same sort of like, oh, this is my normal life, this is how I'm going to go about it, I trust my religious leader to do this, and I trust my government to do that. And so right now, when we're looking for people to sort of advise us, if these two sort of significant advisors in many people's lives are at odds with each other, it can create like further, you know, sort of anxiety and distrust and polarization. And that would be sort of my historical answer. But I think it does speak to the present moment as well.
Right, and just to build on that, just religious leaders are already engaged just by the opening the doors of the church. You see just smaller examples as well as those. A colleague of mine attends a church in Nashville. Their pastor appeared on one of the information sessions that Health and Human Services and the Trump campaign did about COVID-19 outbreak. And so on larger scale, they're engaged in these conversations, and it would be hopeful. I hope that their engagement will be meaningful, but we're seeing cases where that's not the case. And so I think religious organizations play or should play a crucial role, but they should play a role that in a way that is informed by science rather than just speaking against science.
So we have a question from a participant that's really germane, Ryan, to what you said there. And so Richard, if it's okay, before you ask another question, I'm going to jump in with Rachel's question from the Q&A. Rachel asks, do scholars of religion have any particular responsibility to name or engage with religious communities whose actions are harmful to public health? That is, what, if any, are the professional and perhaps ethical responsibilities for scholars of religion or potentially religious leaders in this moment? And I don't know, Ryan or Pippa, who would like to maybe respond to that.
Me, Pippa? So yes, I do believe it. I engage with a number of my friends and colleagues who are ministers and lead congregations, as well as my friends who are believers about COVID-19 outbreak, and try to provide them some type of information. Even my own family, it's not always appreciated because they believe, unfortunately, that the COVID-19 is something that will just pass, or that God will protect them, so on and so forth. But I think that there should be more research and push from some of our top journals about COVID-19 outbreak, about the factors that are religious factors that are predicting people's beliefs, and what are the consequences of the outbreak and the beliefs on individuals' beliefs about religion as well as their religious practices.
I think this is tricky. And I mean, in my classroom, for example, when I assign students to go visit different religious communities, I said, do not go to any service that is not following the public health guidelines. And, you know, and that, you know, that's just the bottom line there. I think that I've always worried about saying something that will turn someone off, right? Like that will end the conversation. And so I think that, you know, on one level, you have to be like, that is a conspiracy theory. That is not true. That is, we can't have a conversation when you're engaging in something that is so out of left field, right? But I do think that we have a responsibility to engage people and understand why they feel the way they do, right? are they lonely? Is that why they want to keep going out to dinner at a restaurant? Like what's the issue here? And how can we talk about, the question of community and what community means in a time of pandemic? And how can we, and what kind of resources are available? What kind of inequities are creating more isolation for some people than for others? And so I think, well, there's like sort of there's a fine line between, being like, we need to be responsible scholars and advocates for public health, and also, and turning off that conversation where you don't have that chance to really advocate and change someone's mind. I'm more of a historian, so I always try to kind of contextualize everything in the past, but I do think it's important to engage people.
Right.
Well, and it's interesting for me, I guess, to think about kind of as a scholar and teacher of communication, to think about our role in teaching young people, for example, as well as teaching those around us, to see conversation as an opportunity for co-creation, as an opportunity to make meaning together, as opposed to just correct information. As you said, Pippa, you want to correct that incorrect information, and at the same time, you want to keep that conversation going, right? Because if that person, hung on to that information that is potentially incorrect, as you said, there's usually a reason for doing that. And so learning more about saying, tell me more about where you heard that, or tell me more about who you heard that from, those kinds of things can often help, I think, keep that conversation going. That's a really good point.
Pippa mentioned the 18th century yellow fever epidemic in the United States. Back then, no one had ever heard of a bacterium or a virus. They were literally unknown. Since then, we've identified them, identified their genomes, developed drugs against them, vaccines. I think the popular imagination is captivated by the great progress science has made in the last couple of hundred years. I think many people don't think religion is as dynamic. It has, in a sense, progressed as much over that period of time. Is there anything we can do to help people understand how adaptable and dynamic religion and faith communities are? Because they're so often portrayed, I think, as reactionary.
I mean, I think this is a big problem. And I mean, it's kind of what I spent a lot of time working on in my book. I think that people view religious people in the past as sort of passively suffering, right? Like thinking like, oh, God is punishing me and there's nothing I can do about it. But there's actually, there's this side of thought that, actually God actually is motivating people to respond to suffering, and God gives people science and medicine to cultivate ideas and to cultivate new developments and healing people and in helping people. And I bet, that's something that Ryan mentioned, the article with, I can't remember his name, Collins, is that who the director who was talking about how do we reach out to health communities. And he's a scientist who speaks very much about the role of faith in his work. And I think that is a side of religion that people often don't really know how to talk about, but it's definitely there. It is not a static force that never is changing, just like science, religion changes and sort of helps people orient themselves to the world wherever the world is. And I think that some people are resistant to that. Because if a religion changes, it seems like it's not reliable. But so you kind of have to get over that and help them understand that this is historically how religion has always operated. It's always changed. And that there's something really wonderful about that. And for better or worse, that's something we need in a conversation like this.
Ryan, did you want to add something to that?
No, I think she said everything. My concern also is how the pandemic and how religion is changing and adapting, but also can it adapt in ways that still provide supports for older adults? And so personally, I know as well as a number of my colleagues, I don't feel comfortable advising individuals with multiple chronic conditions, older adults, individuals that I primarily study, to attend religious services. I think the risks far outweigh the rewards. And so how does religion have to change to be protective of certain populations, especially when it's for congregations that it depends on bodies within pews?
We've got a question in the chat that relates pretty specifically to sort of thinking about changes in religion. So I might jump in with that if that's okay. And I think, Philippa, this one might be well suited for your background, but Ryan, please jump in as well. This is from Andrew Gardner. Thinking about how drastically so many religious congregations have adapted to using Zoom and other technologies this year, what changes do you think might be permanent? And are there parallel changes that you can think of that permanently change religious life in other historic pandemics like the Spanish flu or bubonic plague? So Pippa, maybe start with you, and then Ryan, if you want to jump in as well too, that'd be great. And Richard, you might have some ideas here as well.
I've heard that there are ways for some congregations, this is actually, the giving is up. I don't know, I haven't looked at recent studies, but you can see that in some ways online donations improve church websites, improve social media platforms. This could be really a helpful push into the 21st century for some churches. But I think that some of those churches already had the resources on the ground to make those shifts. I don't think that congregations that were already dying are going to be helped by this. Maybe dying, is dying the wrong word? I'm not a modern, I don't study 21st century churches, but I think that these congregations that were declining in membership drastically really have suffered and probably aren't going to bounce back from this. But I think other churches have used it as an opportunity, have seen it as an opportunity. And I shouldn't just say churches. A lot of my students wrote about going to like Buddhist meditation, and they're going to start going all the time because it's something they can do from their dorm room now, right? They don't have to go to the local church that houses the Buddhist meditation. So I think that there are possibilities for how this is really changing congregational life in America. And I mean congregational in a broader sense than the sort of Protestant connotation it has. But I can't think of historically an example of that same sort of technological shift. And I'll ponder it and maybe let Ryan answer.
So it's so what we're seeing is that it changes the options that are available. And so maybe 5 years ago, really 2 years ago, I would find the religious congregation in my area to attend, someplace I can drive to. Now, since church for me primarily happens virtually, the world is my option. I can go to Hillsong's, I can go to T.D. Jakes' church in Dallas, I can go to Jamal Bryant's church in Atlanta. And so it opens up the market for for individuals who have access to the World Wide Web, and that they can attend church religious services anytime they want. They may not have to be connected to their personal local community. They may not have personal friendships, individuals that they can see or know or have relationships. The relationships may largely be virtual. And so it opens up the market in many ways than what we saw in the past. And how local smaller congregations, especially those that don't have access to Zoom, even Zoom backgrounds, I've seen some pastors, some churches just struggle with keeping their service streamed online for an entire part, or how to arrange that. I think that this will either force them to adapt or they may suffer the consequences. But I can't see that. I think looking long term, for congregations that do make it past this outbreak, web-based services will be a vital component of their ministries, as well as web-based ministries, connections to Facebook, Instagram, so on and so forth.
I remember reading in 2018, former U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy suggesting that the United States is in an epidemic of loneliness. Now, again, this is 2 years before the pandemic. I remember him saying that loneliness is about as bad for a human being as smoking 16 cigarettes a day. That's just in terms of health consequences. Obviously, there are a number of other facets of suffering. So one way to overcome that for churches in the pandemic has been to develop new media of communication, turning to video conferencing for services and so forth. Have faith communities stepped up to the plate and enhanced not only the delivery channels, but also the message itself in ways that are meeting this epidemic of loneliness, do you think?
Would you like to? I see some do. I see at least the congregations that I'm familiar with. Some of them try to reach out, but I think there's still so obviously, yes, social isolation has deleterious effects on individuals' mental health. It's a long-standing research within the social sciences. But how we can do that, and so as I enjoy this meeting, but it's individuals have Zoom fatigue, and so logging on through the screen and having these types of interactions. I think the human beings many individuals, still require some type of other form of intimacy, a type of face-to-face contact, and how congregations can facilitate that, I'm unsure.
I'd like to briefly echo what Ryan said. We're doing a lot of telehealth, telemedicine now, interacting with patients over Zoom. And thank goodness we can do that because we're reaching patients, families we otherwise wouldn't be able to see at all. But on the other hand, some people need a hug.
Yeah.
And Zoom is no substitute for that, human contact. And I hope we can get back to the healing power of touch, as well as visual images and words in our approaches. And I suspect that's as important for faith communities as it is for healthcare.
Agree.
So there are a couple of questions that have come up from the Q&A that will take our conversation in a slightly different direction. I think I might go to those and then we might come back to sort of talking about the partnership piece here, if that's okay with everyone. One of the questions that Amanda Friesen asked was sort of asking us to sort of broaden our perspective as we think about these questions. She says, though we're talking about religion, in many examples, we're focusing on Christian sort of traditions and perspectives. And Philippa, you mentioned sort of Buddhist meditation as an example of a place where your students were engaging. How are other faith traditions thinking about these issues, and how have you seen engagement sort of play out in those spaces? Ryan, do you want to start?
Sure. So someone flashed this to me from Chicago. So you see some individuals like the Nation of Islam, for instance, Louis Farrakhan saying or encouraging his followers not to take the vaccine, that it may, lead to further death and mass genocide among religious communities. I think you see some also cases in New York where certain Jewish religious communities are still having these massive gatherings of individuals. And so I think that regardless of denominational or regardless of religious traditions, that there's still this type of binary where we see that your religion offers you a form of protection that science can't offer. And so therefore I can engage in a larger society in ways that I may not, the CDC may suggest I not engage.
Philippa, anything to add there?
I think that, again, going back to what my students report to me, and kind of connected to what Ryan was saying, with virtual services, I was surprised how much more willing students were to go outside of their sort of their comfort zone, and how many of them were willing to Zoom into a mosque or Zoom into a temple or a synagogue, and sort of check out a totally different religious world. And from what I heard from them, it was very vibrant. Every community that they visited sounded like it was adapting and it was transitioning. But that said, those are the ones that were able to sort of advertise, right? And that had that social media know how to reach someone like my student who was looking for a different religious community to visit. So I'm an expert in colonial America. I know a lot more about Christianity and colonial America than I know about kind of modern world religious communities in the U.S. right now. But I do think that there is this adaptation. I could also see, since Ryan brought up the Nation of Islam, I could also see that communities that are already anxious about the U.S. government and its authority in sort of regulating religious life and its very Protestant underpinnings that still really shape American life and culture and government. I could see that could create more resistance and more anxiety about outlining sort of restrictions on religious services. And I think that is part of what we saw in New York with the Jewish communities there and the large gatherings there, and sort of this continuing rhetoric about, well, is this really fair? Are you targeting minority religious communities? And I think that just like with questions of vaccine and public health, that question of religious regulation of minority communities is alive and well and needs to be attended to, and people need to be cognizant of it.
Related to that, there's another question in the chat, and that might kind of get us into some of these conversations that are, I think, about an unrealistic binary that's created between science and religion that I think plays well in media sometimes, and that's why it gets the coverage it does. So Paul asks, many, quote, COVID skeptics object, especially to bans on religious gatherings, often pointing by contrast to no such bans or less extensive bans on restaurants, bars, and grocery stores. And the next thought is often that this shows prejudice against religion and privileges secular life. How realistic is that characterization, that sort of either or, and what other thoughts do you have about medically inflicted religion secular commentary? And I will say that in my experience as a communication scholar, this is one of the spaces that's of interest to me, that as I know many physicians and scientists of faith who talk about their work and their faith life in very instructive ways. And I think that what we tend to see portrayed is this sort of binary of it's either reason or faith, instead of seeing this space for both. So I'd be interested, and Richard, you may want to speak to this as well, interested to hear kind of what might be an alternative rhetoric or an alternative string of conversation that would allow the community to have a richer and less polarizing conversation about the relationship between faith and science in a space like this.
Which would you like to go first?
Richard, do you want to jump in first? You're muted, Richard.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's an overly simplistic but somehow seductive notion that religion and science are pitted against each other. And certainly Ryan's example of Francis Collins, there are very many eminent scientists who are quite cognizant of their religious roots, and in fact aren't afraid to introduce faith into a tradition, into the conversation around, say, public health crisis like this. But I mean, just by way of shorthand, it has to be said that science and medicine also are grounded in faith. I mean, there are some things we take for granted that enable us to do our jobs every day. We too are proceeding in faith in a sense. And I'm afraid that I see this even in the hospital and healthcare institutions. Very often, doctors and nurses will do what they can for patients, but if they reach what seems to be an insurmountable obstacle, sometimes that's the point at which they call in the chaplain. You know, our diagnostic and therapeutic efforts don't seem to be bearing fruit. We may be coming to the end of the road in one sense or another, and now it's time to invite a representative of religion in the room. That's a very unfortunate I think, characterization of the relationship between religion and science that I think is being perpetuated and maybe even fomented by the popular news media. We need to get beyond it.
Ryan or Pippa, would you like to add anything to that?
I think also engaging for individuals who do believe that that the state is somewhat treating religious organizations differently than they would treat restaurants and others, showing how interactions in restaurants is different from church or religious services. And so if I go shopping in Walmart, I'm usually by myself. I go have a list, grab the things, go in and out. I'm not standing up and down. I'm not singing. I'm not shaking my neighbor's hands. I'm not in close proximity to other individuals intentionally, which is a key component of many of our religious traditions, is this engaging with each other.
I think it also comes up a lot in sort of, I don't know, my social media world, the sort of disgust, I guess, I'm seeing over the fact that churches got PPP loans. I don't know if any of you have noticed that. But that's a great example where I think that this religious secular divide is really kind of problematic, because churches are major employers, right? And they are, you know, people who work for churches need assistance just as much as people who work for you know, bars and restaurants. And I think that thinking of a church in an economic sense can be really helpful, right? In a moment like this, it's central to the community in a similar way to a restaurant. And I'm not trying to minimize what a church or a religious place of worship more broadly does in a community, but I think that, you know, in a sense, they both serve people, and there is that religious secular divide makes us not pay attention to that, right? That just as many people go to Panera on a Sunday morning to talk with their women's group as they do go to church, and they're all suffering, and the people who work in these places are also suffering. And so I think we need to sort of think outside the box when it comes to this dichotomy. It's not as helpful as I think we would like it to be.
I'd like to ask Philippa, you know, the so-called 1918 Spanish flu, certainly a misnomer, but a real worldwide catastrophe. I think it's thought maybe 500 million people were infected, and deaths may have numbered 50 million or something to that effect. Are there lessons we can glean from pandemics like that that we've forgotten in the interim? Say, you know, the role religion or faith communities played in a crisis like that, not only comforting the suffering, but perhaps bringing people together in ways that actually enhanced communities' responses to the pandemic.
I actually, 1918 epidemic is too late for me.
Right. Well, but, as you say, there are others like the yellow fever, for example.
I can't speak to that one, but I think that, you know, I think that religion, so a lot of what I study is providence, and how sort of allusions to God's providence can be extremely helpful for people in terms of understanding how to respond to something, and not just in sort of a like, I'm going to passively wait for God to punish me, but rather like, what is God calling me to do right now? But it's also really important for how people sort of narrate what is going on in their lives. Because one of the worst things about disease, one of the worst things about epidemics is how it says that whole life you had planned, that everything you've been doing, it no longer makes sense. And you're gonna have to tell a new story. And one of the things about God's providence is that it's this sort of way of saying, okay, what does God mean for me to do in this situation? What does all of this mean? How am I going to look back on this and understand this, you know, in 10 years? What will it mean for the story of my life? And I think that people in previous generations maybe were a little bit more attuned to understanding how important that role of narrative was in terms of navigating through a health crisis. It's still there today. I mean, people still say things like, you know, everything happens for a reason, right? Or God is in control. But there's a way in which that sort of methodical work of repentance, if you're thinking in a Christian tradition, was very helpful. I think in terms of narrating yourself through a catastrophe, through a crisis, and whether or not that's there today kind of depends where you live, how you place yourself, what you believe. whether or not you're willing to ascribe meaning to disease and suffering.
There are a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A that I would like to maybe turn our attention to a little bit that focus on the intersection between the pandemic and race. And I think that that's an important space that's worth interrogating. Pippa, you were talking about the idea of sort of narrating the experience. And one of the things that we know is that communities of color who have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, whether those are economic or physical effects, that those stories have been less told in popular media in the United States, at least than we've seen other stories that have been told. So there's a question that I'll read, and then there are a couple of other questions that I think could be helpful here that we might jump into. So Amy asked, how can scholars of religion address the systemic racism inherent in the response to pandemics? Is the intersection of religion, race, and illness a place where religion scholars can offer a much needed informed critique? And I wonder, Ryan, if you want to start in response to that, and then Pippa and Richard, if you have things to add.
I think it's difficult for congregations to do that, but it's something that should be put on the table. And so I think what the news brief that came out from Pew like last week, we've seen like since May, the proportion of Black Americans who know someone that's either been hospitalized and or died from COVID-19 has went from, I think, 28% in May, and it's over 60% now when respondents were surveyed last month. And so wondering, as I have, would the response to the COVID-19 outbreak be differently if it disproportionately affected non-Black communities? And so there's almost, at least when we go back to the media, at least with some pastors, Kenneth Copeland, I'm thinking of one example, where there's almost joking, where he's blowing away the COVID-19 the outbreak, he's blowing away the devil from his congregation. Well, would we say that, does he do the same for Alzheimer's, breast cancer, and other causes of death that are more prominent in congregations like his? Or is the belief that whites aren't largely being affected by the COVID-19 outbreak driving some of the lack of seriousness that we see from some faith communities and how they're treating the outbreak and the pandemic? And so how racism is embedded in there. And then also the narratives we see within hospitals and with Blacks being turned away from hospitals, or quote unquote medical racism, and its role in increasing the outbreak as well as the treatment of COVID-19 among minority communities. Is something that congregations, I believe, should address, but I'm not sure if they have the tools available to address that, both in just in simple terms of informing their congregants about this.
I think historically, I mean, this is the hard part about studying medicine or the history of medicine, I think, is that historically you see this, like, these really bad things that happen, right? And this goes back, like charitable hospitals, right? Like the sort of experimental care that could occur. And I also study maternity in the 18th century. And so like how, cutting women's bodies up, right? And trying to figure out what went wrong with gestation. And there's a lot of examples in history of Black communities suffering indignities at the hand of the medical world. And I think that that's really, it's something that you have to we have to acknowledge if we're going to have a conversation and if we're going to be effective, especially in this moment with vaccine distribution, is how do you, there's all these white reformers, right, who are trying to, or you question their motivations, right? You question what they're doing in the name of benevolence, right? In the name of doing good, often with sort of a religious missionary appeal, and like John Wesley, for example, right? But sometimes there's some real systemic inequities that are at play that make us, that have sparked this suspicion of medicine, and that we can't just push under the rug. We have to acknowledge, and we have to understand that those benevolent motivations are often racist motivations and or classist motivations that have to be addressed. And that's why I think the transparency around the trials and the work that the trials for this current vaccine or the two newest vaccines have done to sort of have some real diversity in the trial population has been really important. Like that's one step. But I think I got away from the question of the scholar of religion and what scholars of religion are supposed to do. So I'll step back.
I think that that's helpful, Pippa, in part because it gets actually to another question that we have in the chat. So Ryan, if you want to respond, because I think you have something to add. I think that was who I heard, and then Pippa add on.
It's also it's somewhat frustrating to hear some like Black leaders of congregations from the civil rights tradition, for them to express skepticism about the medication usage or finding solutions in the cure, and they liken it to the Tuskegee experiments. Well, this isn't syphilis. And so having scholars engage and say, well, yes, the Tuskegee did happen, but in this case, this is COVID-19 is much different than what they experienced in the 1930s to the 1970s during the Tuskegee experiments would be important.
That's a really good point, Ryan, that there's that space, again, that space for privilege and conversation to say, you know, where are the similarities and where are the differences that exist between conversations that were happening then and structural inequities that existed then, and how do we shape what we're doing now. Pippa, to your point about creating, for example, clinical trial populations that better match the populations of folks that might potentially take the vaccine, I think is an important piece of this. Richard, I noticed you turned your mic on. Would you like to add something there?
Yeah, I just think we tend to define the pandemic in strictly scientific or medical terms, which leads us to suppose that all the real solutions are scientific and medical, and that all the lessons we need to learn are scientific and medical. And I just think that's dead wrong. Nobody would wish a pandemic, a plague on anyone, although in fact there are points in history that would belie what I just said, but certainly no good person or good community would wish a plague on anyone. But when plagues occur, it's quite possible that there are lessons waiting to be gleaned by individuals and communities. In Albert Camus' The Plague, one of the very best non-scriptural texts anybody could read in the midst of a pandemic like this, he suggests that the citizens of the town that's afflicted by the plague can't see anything beyond the ground in front of their own 2 feet. And I think despite all our scientific progress and economic wherewithal, we're in a very similar position. It's quite possible that we'll vaccinate everybody, and that can't come too soon for any of us, but that we will have ended up treating this as strictly a medical or scientific problem and have failed to learn the human lessons that I think human beings are in a way always expected and perhaps hope to be able to extract from an experience like this. We might emerge having suffered a great deal, yet somehow humanly and perhaps even spiritually enriched from this terrible plague. And what a shame it would be if we don't seize that opportunity.
Richard, to that point, there's a question in the chat that I think is related to that, and this might be a place that we might get a couple of final thoughts from our panelists. This is the most recent question that was asked from Rebecca. How could ethics be a way for religion and scientific communities to find common ground in our conversations about how to respond to the current pandemic? Both religion and medicine seem to have a focus on ethics of care. And so I'm wondering, you know, Ryan, as you kind of talk about and engage with communities and with congregations, how you see sort of ethic of care being a space where potentially science and religion can come together to find that place of common ground.
Great points. Yes, I think that should occur. How that occurs, I think that's a need for much broader conversation. So typically when we express concern, thinking of someone who of past, you usually go and you expressing care and concern, you go by their house, you visit, you engage with them, you give them a hug. I think as Richard mentioned earlier, I'm not sure individuals can do that now. And so I think we need to create a space to think about how can we express care given the current situation.
A really great point, right? I have a good friend who I was chatting with who grew up in Minnesota who, you know, where covered dish care is quite strong, right? Like you bring a covered dish. And so I think that you're right to say, thinking about what does, helping your, your older parent set up a Zoom call with their siblings, how does that bring care to someone's life in a way that, a way that is needed right now and looks different than what we've done in the past? That's a really good point. Pippa or Richard, do you want to add to that notion of an ethic of care that both we see in medicine and in faith that might be helpful here?
Oh, when I guest lecture for the physician assistant program every once in a while, and ethics and nursing are and healthcare work in general are all sort of about relationships, right? I mean, we wouldn't have to worry about ethics if we didn't live in relationship to other people. Ethics is a question of relations, and I think that's the issue here in talking about, and what Ryan is getting at is how do we show that relationship, right? How can we, or touch or intimacy, how do we develop that in this kind of virtual world that we're living in? And I think that religion and healthcare are both really one of those few places people have that chance right now, virtual or not, where you can still sort of reach out to someone and form that sort of sense of like, I'm a human and you're a human too. And how are we being transformed by this, and how can we support each other?
I'd just make an appeal to everybody in our conversation today. In healthcare, some institutions are really strapped at the moment, really struggling to provide care to patients. We're bursting at the seams. And sometimes we can become ever more resolutely focused on the kinds of things you learn in nursing school and medical school, like keeping good medical records and making sure the prescriptions are written appropriately and so forth. And we get even worse at attending to the whole human person. And I think religion and faith traditions, communities of faith, really have something to teach us about the art of presence. I think of the book of Job, when Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar come on the scene of what used to be the greatest man in all the East. He's fallen as far as any human being could fall. They take a seat. They sit down beside him for 7 days and 7 nights. And that's a human art, and I think a human excellence that this pandemic should be making us hungry for, and also offering some pretty deep lessons on how we can cultivate it, the art of presence.
And as a communication scholar, I think that that's one of the most important things that we have, right? That's what makes us ultimately human, is this ability to communicate and connect with one another. And so that, again, that notion of co-creation of meaning that comes from communing together in that space, whether that's a virtual space like we have now or the physical space, is an important part, we know, of health and healing. So I appreciate you saying those things, Richard, and thanks to both of our panelists for sort of adding on. We've got just about a minute left for conversation. So what I'd like to do is to give Ryan and Pippa just kind of an opportunity each to share maybe 20 or 30 seconds of final thoughts before we wrap up. So Ryan, we'll start with you.
Sure. Again, I thank you all for the opportunity. To my colleagues who study religious life, it's just really a challenge to look at how the multifaceted ways that religion is being shaped by, and also responds to or shapes our responses to the COVID-19 outbreak should be definitely a line of research that a number of people should begin picking up. I know Andrew Whitehead does some of this work, Sam Perry as well, but just definitely looking at this just to bring more attention, because in the end, we create information that other scholars in the public use to understand this moment.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Pippa, just about 30 seconds or so. What are your thoughts?
Thank you for inviting me to participate. And I think I'll echo what Ryan said, that this is such an important area of research, but it's also a really important area of teaching. And students tell me again and again how meaningful it is to get a chance to talk about what religion means for their bodies and their health, and what it means to lose people. And all of these questions are just going to become even more pertinent in their lives moving forward. So I just highly recommend jumping into teaching on a topic like this if you have a chance. It's incredibly rewarding. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Pippa and Ryan. Richard, I know that you've got your, I think I saw you turn your mic on. Anything that you want to add? And I think Nat's going to pull up a slide for us that has our next conversation listed on it. I just want to thank you, so humbly thank all of you for participating in this conversation today. What a wonderful opportunity to connect with each of you. We're talking about connection, talking about these important issues. It just gives me a lot of hope just to kind of hear the great conversation I think that comes from this. So the Religion and series is continuing in January, on January 21st from 3 to 4 Eastern time. Our topic is religion and memorializing the state. The other thing that we want to remind you of is you will receive a survey about today's event, and we would really love your feedback, your thoughts and ideas about what might come next and how we can make these meaningful for all of you. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you to Dr. Tucker Edmonds, Dr. Gunderman, Dr. Cobb, and Dr. Koch. I am again so humbled to have been in the room with all of you today, and I really appreciate your great thoughts and ideas. And thank you so much to all of our audience members for great questions today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Krista.
Thank you. Bye-bye.